5th Legion, the White Scars. Primarch, Jagatai Khan. Allegiance, Loyalists. Homeworld, Chogoris. Current Commander, Jubal Khan. Specialization, Fast Hit and Run Assault. Battle Cry, for the Khan and the Emperor. In the days of the Unification Wars on Terra, the 5th Legion was honed and tempered as scouts, raiders, and hunters. Recruits were largely taken from the ice wastes of the Thulian Basin, and their unique physiology and durability made them ideal for hunting the warlords, demagogues, and rebellious rulers of Terra who were still hiding in the wastelands, caverns, and underground bunkers. Their numbers were few compared to the other legions, but their effectiveness was never in doubt, as they were capable of severely weakening enemy forces and strongholds before the arrival of the main Imperial forces. One unique aspect of the 5th Legion in its early days is that they were largely divided, split into various pioneer companies of around 1,000 to 3,000 Marines each. Recruiting from different locations and interacting with different cultures and peoples on Terra created in them a diverse and differentiated series of traditions, customs, and beliefs among the companies, making each company of the 5th unique in and of itself. Even after the discovery of their Primarch, these traditions and unique customs would live on and would lay the groundwork for the planting of warrior lodges within the Legion later during the Great Crusade. Because of their gift at hunting and seeking the enemies of the Emperor, the 5th Legion would be one of the first legions that began deploying beyond Terra and recruiting from off-world as they traveled. However, their roaming and free-spirited nature came with its own consequences. The 5th Legion, or Star Hunters as they came to be called, became distant from their cousins, working beyond the outer rim of the Crusade's territories and only taking orders from the Emperor himself. Further, many of their battles and engagements were unnoticed and unappreciated. Of course, this didn't bother the 5th, as they actually relished the idea of silence and unspoken purpose and glory. As a result, they came to be further nicknamed Terra's Forgotten Sons. During the Great Crusade, the Star Hunters pioneered the way for the Crusade itself, seeking out planets and discovering the life and peoples there. It was indeed the 5th who found the world of Chthoniya, home of Horus Lupercal, and thus discovered the first of the Emperor's lost Primarchs. This pioneering lifestyle taught the Star Hunters the art of hit-and-run tactics. A typical tactic of the 5th would be to engage an enemy swiftly and mercilessly to gauge their defenses, then draw out the enemy to battle to test their reaction capabilities and strength. Then they would relay all this information back to the Imperium for analysis. However, their self-imposed isolation, alongside their hit-and-run style of engagement, led to a severe problem for the Legion, namely a steady and constant loss of manpower. With each new engagement, the Legion would suffer serious losses over time. But the pride of the 5th wouldn't allow them to ask for aid or support, and so they allowed themselves to accept their fate, choosing to let their Legion die in the battles and manners of their own choosing. The 5th may well have died early, if not for the timely discovery of Chogoris and their gene father, the Warhawk. Like all his brothers, the Primarch known as Jagatai Khan was sent away from Terra and landed on the world of Chogoris. A primitive but fertile world of vast open plains and rich waters, the people of Chogoris were tribal and warring in nature, and their level of technology was only at the black powder level. Jagatai was found as a toddler by Khan, the leader of a small tribe who saw him as a gift from the gods. As he grew, he became strong, shrewd, and wise, and he brought fear and uncertainty to the rival tribes. When Khan was killed by a rival tribe leader, Jagatai swore vengeance and led his armies to kill him, even though Jagatai was nothing more than a child at the time. And it was from this experience that Jagatai would decide that change needed to come to his world, and he began a 20-year-long war to end the deadly regime ruling his people. He led a brutal campaign to overthrow the ruling Palatine of Chogoris, united all the tribes under his banner, and eventually took down the empire that had risen up on Chogoris and had lasted for so many centuries. Jagatai did not want to rule the planet himself, but was left with no other choice, as the people now looked to him as a guide and a mentor. 6 months after taking the throne of Chogoris, the Emperor would arrive, and the Khan would recognize him at once as his father. The Khan bent the knee to the Emperor and swore his loyalty to him. He was given command of the 5th Legion, and he would rename them the White Scars. The name is something of a mystery, and there are various theories as to where the name comes from. The most prominent is that it has to do with a Chogorian ritual in which warriors take a ceremonial knife and carve a special scar onto their face. Then they burn the cut to turn the repaired skin white, leaving behind a vivid white scar. Jagatai sought out his various vagabond sons and unified them under a singular legion, tradition, and identity. He incorporated some of his own Chogorian natives into the legion, and he also had all the non-Chogoran White Scars take part in a blooding ritual, and had them adopt Chogoran names to better feel assimilated. Under his guidance and leadership, the White Scars became absolute masters of speed, ferocity, and savage engagement. However, there were problems. Jagatai did struggle somewhat in his adjustments. Due to the primitive nature of his homeworld, it took a considerable amount of time for him to adjust to the more advanced technology and ways of the Imperium. Not only this, but the language of Chogoris is difficult for non-natives to pick up and master, meaning there was always a sense of disharmony and disunity between the Imperium and the new White Scars of Chogoris. But perhaps most damning of all for Jagatai and the White Scars was that the Great Khan was wary of the Emperor. While Jagatai did see the Emperor as the man most likely to help him achieve his dream of unifying the stars and bringing humanity into a prosperous age, he also saw the Emperor for what he was, a tyrant in the making. He saw the imperial truth as a lie and a dangerous misdirection. And most of all, he was not a fan of the Emperor's heavy-handed means of forcing conformity and subjugation to it. Unlike some who were silent about their issues with the Emperor and his plans, Jagatai was more outspoken, and this created something of a rift between him and his brothers. Some doubted his loyalty and his ability, with his only true friends among his brothers being Horus Lupercal, Sanguinius, and Magnus the Red. However, others among his brothers detested him, such as Fulgrim. Regardless, Jagatai Khan would unify his sons during their wars in the Chloronic Circle, where they waged war against massive orc forces. Not only were the White Scars successful in their wars here, but they had learned to adopt the fighting prowess of Chogoris' warriors, using sweeping strike and retreat tactics and encirclement strategies. The White Scars had truly been molded into something new and impressive. But the Khan didn't stop there. He encouraged all of his sons to adopt noble pursuits such as calligraphy, throat singing, painting, oratory skills, and other such hobbies in an attempt to bring culture to his sons. Though the rest of the Imperium saw them as savages and unworthy of note, the White Scars were disciplined and noble warriors, far more capable and lethal than any were aware. And this would be to the White Scars' benefit as the Imperium began to take a dark and devastating turn towards chaos and damnation. At the beginning of the Horus Heresy, the Imperium hadn't fully felt the full weight of the events that were about to unfold. Not all knew of the Dropsite Massacre, and this included the White Scars. Their first news of it would come from Rogel Dorn, who sent a message to the Scars to return to Terra immediately and prepare for a defense against the coming traitors. However, Jagatai would receive another message from Horus, who would ask him to attack and destroy the Space Wolves Legion, who had just finished their assault on the planet Prospero, home of Magnus the Red and his 1,000 Sons Legion. The reason for this confusing string of messages was simple. No one knew whose side Jagatai Khan would be on. Jagatai and the White Scars had always been distant and secretive. He cared about humanity, but he was more than critical of the Emperor. He fought against the foes of man with a passion, but his methods, ways of war, and philosophies were not well known. So when the heresy was beginning, no one was sure who he would side with. Jagatai wasn't entirely sure either. He wanted answers, and so rather than go straight to Terra, he took his fleet to Prospero to learn the truth. Magnus the Red had been one of the few brothers of Jagatai who he had a friendship with, and he wanted to understand why the Space Wolves and Leman Russ had done what they had on the planet. There, Jagatai would confront a spectral version of Magnus, telling him he could not sit out this war, and he would need to choose a side. Then, upon saying farewell to Magnus and banishing his spectral form, he was then confronted by another one of his brothers, Mortarion and the Death Guard, who had come to try to convince him to join Horus. The Khan lamented this choice, He did not trust the Emperor, and he had a very close friendship with Horus. He was having to choose between a father he did not love and a brother he did. But in the end, Jagatai chose not to side with Horus. He explained that the primarchs were not empire builders. They were not emperors. That was a role only the Emperor of Man could hold. Horus was the puppet of powers he had no understanding of, and he would lead humanity into damnation. He would not be a part of it. And so the two came to blows, and after a brief skirmish, Mortarion and his Death Guard were forced to retreat. But the White Scars had more problems. While Jagatai had been on the planet, a large portion of the White Scars, led by Torgun Khan, attempted a coup and a hostile takeover of the Legion. The various warriors' lodges that arose in the Legion, thanks to the diversity of cultures, customs, and traditions within it from its very founding early in its history, had laid the groundwork for chaos's interference. Many of the Terran-born or non-Chogoris-born Scars were sympathetic to Horus and were itching to turn the Scars to his use. However, the Chogoris-born sons were loyal to the Khan and were unwilling to give up their legion. A vicious battle took place, which, in the end, saw the traitors brought to heel. When Jagatai returned to see the damage done, he ordered every surviving traitor to be placed in suicide units, where they would die fighting against the enemy in hopeless confrontation. 4 more years would pass, but warp storms were blocking Jagatai and the Legion from reaching Terra. To try and help humanity, the White Scars would wage hit-and-run attacks against Horus's forces. This worked well for a time, as the traitors were unused to the White Scars' abilities and strategies. However, as time passed, this would change. The enemy would begin to learn and adapt, and the Scars found themselves boxed in by the traitors. Only through the discovery of an ancient artifact, the Dark Glass, would the White Scars be able to open a portal into the webway itself and reach Terra at last. But perhaps too late. When the White Scars arrived, the Legion got straight to work assisting in the defense of the planet and the Imperial Palace. Rogel, Dorn, and Sanguinius had been working tirelessly to establish a plan of defense and fortification, and the Scars were to help in any way possible. However, the Khan would learn of the state of the Lionsgate spaceport. He announced his intention to go and retake it, so that the Ultramarines and Dark Angels reinforcements would have a safe place to land. Dorn at first attempted to stop him, saying it was suicidal. The Khan is said to have asked Sanguinius to look into the future and tell him what would happen if he went to the Lionsgate. Sanguinius confirmed that he would die, but that he would save many lives. So without a second thought, the Khan took his legion and left for the spaceport. There, the White Scars would confront the Death Guard Legion and Mortarion again, who had now become a demon prince. This was not an easy battle for the Scars. The Scars were used to fast hit-and-run tactics, while the Death Guard were used to endurance and weathering brutal punishment while still marching on. Further, with the Death Guard having been mutated by Chaos into Plague Marines, they were even more destructive, durable, and dangerous than ever. The Scars were being pushed back and slaughtered. It was then that the Khan confronted his brother Mortarion, and the two engaged in a furious duel. Thanks to Mortarion's mutations, he was now unkillable. He was a bastion of chaotic power and destruction, and the Khan knew it. But this did not stop Jagatai from fighting. But what is most shocking of all is that in the midst of the battle, when the Warhawk seemed little more than a corpse still standing, he laughed at Mortarion. He laughed at his fallen brother. Jagatai revealed why he laughed. Mortarion had always claimed that he was the strongest and most durable of his brothers. He named his legion the Death Guard because they were death incarnate, unafraid of any foe or fate, least of all death. And yet, when confronted with death, when faced with the void, Mortarion had sacrificed his soul and his humanity as well as his legion, traded it all away for immortality. The brave Death Guard had looked death in the face and blinked. So when Mortarion proclaimed he could not be killed, Jagatai agreed, but responded, quote, "But I can, and that makes all the difference." Jagatai then used the last of his strength and decapitated Mortarion, banishing his body back to the warp. The wounds Jagatai suffered, though, were extreme, and he fell near dead to the ground. Seeing their primarch seemingly dead, the White Scars fought on with a rage of newfound vigor and actually pushed back the Death Guard. In the end, their fury proved too much for the sons of Mortarion, and they were able to retake the Lionsgate spaceport. Meanwhile, the White Scars, along with Ilya Ravalion, would have Jagatai taken to Malkador the Sigillite immediately, in the hopes of saving his life. With their primarch out of commission, and undergoing serious medical treatment with the help of Malkador and the Emperor himself, the White Scars would continue assisting in the defense of Terra in every way possible. When the war finally ended and Terra could finally begin to rebuild, they were relieved to learn Jagatai was alive. However, his damaged body would take time to recover. During the rebuilding process, the Loyalist Primarchs held a meeting to determine the next course of action. Lionel Johnson, Rogel Dorn, and Lehman Russ all urged for an immediate hunting of the traitor legions, but Robute Gilliman urged for a rebuilding effort instead. Jagatai Khan agreed with Lion, Dorn, and Russ, but the High Lords of Terra backed Gilliman, and given that they were the acting authority on Terra, they overruled the Primarchs. Eventually, though, during the Great Scouring, which was the eventual decision to pursue and eliminate the traitor elements still in Imperial space, the White Scars would come into contact with not only traitors, but also Dark Eldar forces. Within his own home sector of Yasan near Chogoris, Jagatai encountered a powerful Dark Eldar lord and would pursue him in a vengeful fury. However, the Warhawk was never seen again. It is believed that he is still lost in the webway to this day, battling the Dark Eldar and all other enemies of man within. The loss of Jagatai was a great blow to the White Scars who, without their leader, were left to fall in line with the Codex Astartes, ever more closely fracturing their legion into individual chapters and maintaining a defensive position within the Chogoris system as best they could. The history of the White Scars from here is not so different than any other legion. They were fractured by the Codex Astartes, reduced in size and power, and were left to their own devices. Until around the 13th Black Crusade, the White Scars, like many other Imperial forces, were called to Cadia to assist in stopping Chaos forces from breaching the Eye of Terror. In the end, Cadia was destroyed and the Eye of Terror was ripped open, forming the Great Rift. The White Scars would return to their homeworld, only to see that a Chaos warband known as the Rared Corsairs had arrived and were pillaging and raiding the planet, spreading their chaotic taint. The White Scars fought back with a vengeance and expelled the Corsairs from the planet, but they were unable to fully drive them from the system, and Chogoris to this day still has whole areas and territories that are corrupted and scarred by the touch of chaos. Sometime after this, the White Scars would attempt to take revenge against the Red Corsairs and attack their stronghold. Jubal Khan, the chapter master of the White Scars, would disappear during this quest of vengeance, only to be rediscovered sometime later, having undergone extreme torture at the hands of the Corsairs. He has recovered from his torture, but his physical and mental health is still in dispute. He can no longer leave the Quanzhou, the White Scars fortress, and spends most of his time strapped to a life support chair. He is more than aware of his condition, and while he has lost none of his leadership skills or keenness, Jubal Khan has already begun grooming a new Great Khan to replace him for the eventuality that he will die or be interned in a dreadnought. In a way, the White Scars now somewhat mirror the state of the Imperium at large. A largely scarred and broken force, once noble and majestic, commanded by a weakened but still wise leader, unable to leave his home but watch from afar as his men bleed and die at his command. Truly, how far the White Scars have fallen. The White Scars are commanded by a chapter master, which they refer to as a Great Khan, and all company captains are referred to as just Khans. Recruitment of the White Scars is strictly limited to Chogoris, and regardless of tribe of origin, recruits are spread out among the companies within the chapter known as Brotherhoods. The White Scars see battle as hunts. When engaging in battle, the White Scars will carefully and tactically analyze all aspects of an enemy they confront, and then formulate a strategy to best take it down. To do this, the White Scars employ hit-and-run tactics, preferring range and mobility. This is why the White Scars have more bike squads and land speeders than any other chapter, reflecting their preferred style of combat. But despite this, don't assume the White Scars can't fight in melee. In fact, the White Scars are trained to fight with nuance and complex martial disciplines that encourage calm, focused, and controlled battle tactics, making them unpredictable and unnerving in the heat of combat. Unique among the Space Marine chapters, the White Scars have unique views on certain aspects of Space Marine culture. For example, they have a very strange outlook on the use of dreadnought sarcophaguses. Being a very spiritual chapter, the White Scars find it unseemly and sad to house the spirit of a warrior within a metal and machine body indefinitely rather than let it ride free. However, they also see it as a high honor to commit one's life to the war. It's a complex relationship with the Dreadnought, but it's also why the modern White Scars use them so seldomly. Further, the White Scars have no qualms about the use of their Librarius. Their Storm Seers are their version of Psychers, and they hold a very noble and respectable position in the chapter's hierarchy. At first, the White Scars were suspicious of and very uncertain about the introduction of Primaris Marines into their fold. Corsaro Khan was the first to cross the Rubicon, and he was treated with great suspicion by Jubal Khan for it. However, as their forces have been greatly damaged by the actions of the Red Corsairs in the Great Rift, the White Scars have been left with few options but to accept the need to bring on the Primaris. But perhaps most unique of all among the White Scars is the Master of the Hunt. One specific Khan is chosen from the White Scars as a Master of the Hunt, and his purpose is once every 25 years, he is deployed to hunt an enemy of the White Scars who the chapter is clashed with and has somehow escaped. He must pursue, kill, and then return with the head of his quarry no matter how long it takes. It is a testament to the culture of the chapter and their primitive nature, but also their nobility and sense of honor and duty. The current Master of the Hunt is Corsaro Khan, who has more than earned the title through his incredible deeds. A few notable White Scars include Jubal Khan, the current Great Khan or Chapter Master. Renowned for his shrewd mind and skill as a warrior and tactician, he was captured by the Red Corsairs and tortured until his mind and body were both compromised. Though he was rescued and restored as best as was possible, Jubal Khan is confined to the fortress of Chogoris, strapped to a life support machine to help him stay alive. From there, he helps to maintain control of the White Scars and their forces. There's Corsaro Khan, the Master of the Hunt. Corsaro Khan. He is more than worthy of his title, and was the first White Scar to willingly become a Primaris Marine. This earned him the distrust and suspicion of Jubal Khan, but after a private meeting with him, he could find no fault in Corsaro. Corsaro has slain some of the greatest enemies of the chapter, including Demon Princes, Chaos Lords, and mighty Xenos. And finally, Saboden Khan, the current first captain of the White Scars, and the eventual successor to Jubal Khan as chapter master. His leadership skills and bravery are unquestionable, and Jubal has been taking a severe liking to him, intent on teaching him all he can before he's forced to step down or die. The White Scars have long practiced the art of hit-and-run tactics, making them undeniably fast, efficient, and dangerous. Further, because of their isolated nature, many do not fully understand or anticipate their capabilities, meaning it's hard to know how they will engage or fight. This makes the White Scars devastating in short-term battle. Further, like the Space Wolves, many in the Imperium believe the White Scars to be savage or uncivilized, but this masks the reality that theirs is a deeply cultured and sophisticated chapter with deep roots of tradition and culture, and this makes the White Scars highly unique, not just in terms of warfare, but also in terms of behavior, rituals, and mannerisms. However, there are drawbacks to the chapter. Because the White Scars are stronger in hit and run, they are not as skilled in prolonged and drawn-out battles or sieges. This means that the longer they engage in combat, the more they will start to show their weaknesses. And further, despite their deep culture, Chogoris remains largely primitive, and that means that many White Scars fresh into the chapter will be less accustomed to Imperial technology than other chapters. This puts them at a disadvantage in a galaxy built around tech and machinery, and any foes they fight who excel in machinery or technology will have an advantage over the White Scars. In my personal opinion, I love the White Scars. As someone who studied Asian history and culture, seeing a Mongolian-based Space Marine Legion was really cool. The downside to them is, of course, that they don't get a lot more lore to them. It's actually funny that I've kind of come out and talked about how much I don't like the Space Wolves, but then people call me a hypocrite for liking the White Scars, as they are both very cultured, unique legions based around historical warrior cultures. But for me, what sets the White Scars apart from the Space Wolves is that they're clearly restricted by themselves. The White Scars have struggled, and continue to struggle, to earn the respect of the wider Imperium. Their way of war reflects their cultural roots, but it comes with drawbacks inherent to that style of war. While they do recruit from their own homeworld, it's based on mistrust born from past incidences with outside factors. So much of what makes the White Scars unique is tied into their limitations rather than what makes them super special awesome, and that to me is such a strong testament to them. I've once heard it said that a Mary Sue is powerful because they are special, not the other way around. Truly well-written heroes are special because they earned it, because they became powerful. Izuku Midoriya in My Hero was not a great hero until he trained for it and earned it. Naruto was not a Hokage until he trained for it and earned it. Bruce Wayne was not Batman until he trained for it and earned it. They all had to undergo hardships and had to undergo struggle, fighting against limitations to become the legends that we know them as now. They are special because of what they've undergone. As for the wolves, we'll get to them next time, I suppose. But as for the Scars, I love them. I love them. They've gone through hell and are continuing to go through hell, and yet are still amazing for it. Jagatai Khan is my second favorite Primarch behind Lionel Johnson. His duel with Mortarion is one of my favorites in all of Warhammer, and it is criminal that there aren't more awesome and well-known White Scars in the lore. In my opinion, if there is a chapter that has been overall slept on by the Warhammer devs, it is the White Scars. I know people say, we need more for the Raven Guard. We need more for the Iron Hands. We need more for the Salamanders. We need all... Here's the thing. The White Scars, I feel like, have been so slept on and deserve more attention than they get. Because, as they'll tell you, for the Khan and for the Emperor.